Hi everyone, today's video is all about Trachycarpus Fortunei, which are the palms behind me here. Now they're very easy palm to grow, they're very hardy and they're definitely the most common palm in the UK. But one question I see asked a lot is, can they be grown in pots? So today I wanted to look at simply whether this can be done, a few tips that will help, and whether it's a viable long-term option for your garden. Firstly then, a bit of a backstory on the palms behind me. So I've got 4 Trachycarpus Fortunei in a row, and the trunks are around 1200mm to 1500 tall, which is about 4 or 5 foot tall. Now, I originally bought those about 4 years ago when they were significantly cheaper than they are now, and when they came, they actually arrived in quite small pots, so around that size. A couple are a bit smaller, and what you might not realise if you're new to buying palms is that the pots that they come in, that you buy them from wholesalers or garden centres, they haven't been grown in those pots their entire lives. A lot of palms are actually field grown, basically planted out warmer countries like Spain, then they're dug up, put into smaller pots for transportation, just to bring costs down, let them fit more in the lorries, they're easy to move around, but those pots aren't enough to sustain them long term. So you've got a plant that's had most of its roots chopped off and it's been put into a small pot, which basically means when you buy that plant, to keep it going, to keep it happy for more than a couple months, you need to either repot it up into a larger pot or plant it into the ground. So at the time we lived in a rental house and I didn't want to put the palms into the ground just so then I have to dig them up again, and I knew that eventually one day, within 5 years or so, we'd move to a house, well I hoped anyway, where we'd be able to live long term. So my plan was to put them in pots, and for that I chose large 160 litre pots. Now to give you an idea, this pot here is about 130 litres. So the ones I use are a little bit wider than that. Now you might think that's an absolutely massive pot, and definitely compared to a lot of the pots you can buy in garden centres it is. It's an absolute bucket and they take a lot of moving. But what I found is they soon fill a container even that size. And the palms that I bought, by the time I unpotted them 4 years later, they'd absolutely filled that pot with roots. So to me that means that that plant's expanding its root system and it's reaching a barrier where it just can't get enough nutrients, there's not enough new soil, and it's going to struggle to get enough water to grow effectively. So I don't want to be too negative about palms in pots, but even in a large pot, 160 litres, which is pretty much the biggest you can easily slide around, with careful watering and feeding, there's still a limit on how long you can keep them in a pot and still have them growing healthily. Now, in contrast to that, if you look at the palms behind me now, compared to the photos of when they're in pots, the crowns are a lot fuller now, and one thing you do especially find with Trachycarpus is that they just look healthier in the ground, because they are really. They've got more leaves. When you're growing them in a pot, you tend to find they can only hold, say, 10 leaves before they start to yellow and they get a bit of browning on them and you need to trim them off. But in the ground, if you plant them from a small plant, they can grow with leaves all the way up the trunk and they stay green, so the plant looks healthier. And also, because I've got that direct contact with all the moisture in the ground and they've got a constant flow of natural nutrients, you tend to find that the leaves or the fronds are a darker green colour, where in a pot it's very easy to get yellowing leaves quicker and they can show some of the deficiencies in the soil as the nutrients are depleted. I think the other factor as well that you need to consider is where these palms actually come from, and you might not realise that Trachycarpus actually grow in Asia, in cooler areas, forests with more moisture than what you might expect. Now, a lot of people see the idea of a palm tree as a desert sort of growing plant, but in reality they're not, and they do need that moisture, especially Trachycarpus, which actually prefer our cooler climate to hotter climates where they might run into drought issues. So you can't put that plant in a pot which may dry out every day in summer and expect it to grow as well as it does in the ground. So for that reason, palms that are in the ground just grow so much faster. They've got that constant supply of moisture there. They don't dry out, they don't heat up as much as a plant in a large black pot would. But I appreciate for some people, growing in a pot is the only way forwards. You might not be able to plant in the ground, you might live in a rental house, you might not have the actual room to plant them into the ground, or you might just want to take them with you in the future. In which case, growing in pots, it's not impossible, and there's a few tips that I would use to be able to grow these plants as successfully as possible and keep them healthy for when you can plant them out. So, my top tips then for growing Trachycarpus in pots. Firstly, I wouldn't be afraid of starting small. Now, it's an extreme example, but I bought a batch of about 300 two-leaf seedlings, and I am actually planting a lot of those out now into my garden, which about 3 to 4 years later. And to give you an idea of how quickly they actually develop, I've got here, this is a 10-litre plant. It's probably not the healthiest looking one, but that's a 10-litre plant that I've grown from a two-leaf seedling over 3 years. Now, I'm not saying you need to buy them at size that's that small, and I definitely appreciate there's a need for instant impact, and a plant that's about a foot tall definitely started to look like a tropical feature. So, if you're buying a plant that's small, firstly, it might have been pot grown and the roots won't have been chopped off, so it'll be a healthier plant to start with. And secondly, you can pot it up into gradually larger pots over time, which means that you get more enjoyment out of the plant, more years growth before it actually needs to be planted out. So that'll be my first tip. My second tip is, if you are buying a larger plant especially, plant it into a larger pot. Make sure you go pretty big. Now, I appreciate 160 litres is maybe a little bit unmanageable for some people, and it was only by me dragging them around that I actually got them here, but I would definitely go bigger than you think. And personally, I get a lot of my pots off eBay. If you search for heavy duty pots or large black plastic pots, you'll find the variety that I use. They're definitely an affordable way. They don't look the most attractive, but at our old house I made like a raised bed out of sleepers and put the pots in the line in there, so it sort of disguised the look of them. So by using a big pot, you get in the most lifetime out of that plant as possible before it gets to a point where it really needs to be put in the ground or it'll start to decline. Now, you might have seen a video I did on growing plants in pots and containers, and it's worth checking it out for more advice and general information. But my next tip would be, really consider the compost or soil you're using to put your plant in. Now, for Trachycarpus especially, they enjoy the moisture. They're not plants that really need especially good drainage. As long as they're not sat in water, they'll be happy. So the main thing you need to look at is keeping them watered well enough in summer. So from that perspective, if you use a cheap multi-purpose peat-based compost, which you shouldn't for a lot of reasons, but if you use a compost like that, you tend to find they only last really 6 months, maybe a year, before they start to get a bit dry, they get a bit clumpy, which means they can't hold on to moisture very well, they dry out very quickly, and they don't give the plant what it needs. So what I would recommend is looking at a good soil-based compost, like a John Innes or something like that. Or if you're going to go multi-purpose, get a decent quality multi-purpose, something that feels a little bit heavier. In the past I've had a lot of experience with Jack's Magic and some Levington sorts that were definitely better than a real basic peaty multi-purpose. So definitely think about the compost you're using. For a lot of my feather palms, I actually use coir, but for Trachycarpus, potentially I wouldn't recommend it because it doesn't contain any nutrients itself and it does dry out pretty quickly. Because I was actually planting up so many Trachycarpus and palms at once, I actually bought a big bulk bag of compost with manure mixed in, and my thinking there was that the nutrients would be more slow release over time. You're actually getting a better quality compost or soil, and also it would hold on to moisture better than a more peaty based compost which doesn't have as much organic matter in it. So looking back at the time, how much I needed to water them and how well the compost looked at the end of that period, how well the roots are growing through it, I actually think that's probably worth doing. If you're planting a Trachycarpus into a bigger pot, then probably add a bag of farmyard manure, some kind of organic matter to the compost, and it will help keep that plant healthy for as long as possible. Next up then, and this is quite an important one, it's watering. Now, any plant that's in a pot needs more watering than the equivalent plant in the ground, and for palms it's no different, especially in summer. So what I tend to do with most of my potted plants, other than tree ferns, over winter, if they start to look a bit dry, give them a water, but in general, if you use a big enough pot, they're usually alright just relying on rain, and you can keep them a bit drier over winter anyway. But as soon as warmer and dry weather starts to come around, February, March time, you really need to be on top of your watering. So with a big pot, this can mean maybe a full watering can, even every day in summer. So from that perspective, growing these plants in pots is certainly not a low maintenance option. It takes a lot more work, but you can't underestimate how much water a plant in a pot will need in summer. It's got the hot sun beaming down on a black pot maybe, and that'll dry it out so much quicker than a plant in the ground. It's got a smaller root system, it can't get access to as much natural moisture, so you really need to be on top of the watering if you've got a plant in a pot. So personally, I would tend to use rainwater wherever possible. So if you've got a water butt, then that's great. But if you have to use a hose, it's not the end of the world, and any water is better than not watering your plant enough. The next factor then to keep your Trachycarpus happy in a pot is feeding. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, they are a pretty easygoing plant, they're very easy to look after, and in the ground they actually need very little if any additional food. They'll grow just fine without any intervention and maybe grow a foot a year. But in a pot, the same plants are a lot slower, and the factor you need to think about is just that compost that you're using, especially if it's a standard garden centre multi-purpose mix, it'll run out of nutrients after just a few months. And obviously that plant's in a pot, it's in a closed system, it doesn't have those links into the ground and other natural nutrients, so you do need to make this up with additional fertilisers. So with Trachycarpus, what I tend to do is feed them from April through to say late August, early September, and potentially once every fortnight or once every month because I just forget to do it. But there's a few factors you need to consider when you're doing this. Firstly, don't use a high nitrogen fertiliser, purely because palm trees don't need it. You don't want them to put out lots of really fast growth because it tends to be just floppy, it isn't as hardened off to the wind, and especially at the back end of summer, if you feed them too late, beyond sort of September, October, they put out lots of soft new growth, which, although they're hardy plants, it's more liable to getting damaged by winter frosts, snow, winds, etc. So you don't want that. So personally, what I use, in the past I've used Palm Focus, Palm Booster, but you don't need to buy expensive smaller tubs of fertiliser, and you can actually get a lot of good results just with a liquid seaweed. And combine that with maybe a more diluted general purpose fertiliser and your plants should be absolutely happy. But the main thing is just that you keep it up every month or so, and in reality if you feed them every month from say May through to late August, September, that should be enough to keep them growing well through most of the summer. Now, if you know you're not going to be able to feed your plant regularly or you might forget, one thing you can do at the time of planting, especially if it's in early spring, is to actually work some blood, fish and bone or chicken manure pellets into the compost or soil at the time you're planting it. And this is essentially a very affordable, slow release fertiliser, so you don't need to be quite as consistent throughout the summer. But these are very forgiving palms ultimately. I just want to get across that if you put them in a pot and just leave them like some poor house plant in the same compost for 10-15 years, they won't grow very well and they'll never look healthy. So whilst the plant's never going to absolutely thrive in a pot, you can keep it growing as well as possible and looking as healthy as possible by giving it just a bit of food if you prioritise it, and just make sure they've got some sort of feed once a month from May through to August, September. You won't go far wrong. So hopefully this video has been helpful if you either already grow a Trachycarpus in a pot and want to know how to look after it, or you're looking at buying one this spring. Now, I certainly don't want to discourage anyone from growing these plants in pots, and certainly for the short to medium term it is a very viable option. Hopefully you've got a long-term plan to put it in the ground, but if you don't, then follow my tips. Don't be afraid of buying a plant small. Use the biggest pot that you can to keep it happy in. You'll certainly get a lot of years enjoyment that way. And also really pay attention to the compost, the watering and the feeding, and you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of that palm for a lot of years to come. So thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.